Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our latest webinar. The topic of today's webinar is FDA's new business rules. We'll try to explain what they mean and why they come about. My name is Max Kanevsky. I'm the founder of OpenCDISC and Pinnacle 21. I work with both regulatory agencies, FDA and PMDA, and helping them implement validation technology. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, you'll find an Ask a Question button at the top of the screen. Just type in your question. We'll stop with about 15 minutes left in the webinar and try to answer as many of them as we can. Whatever questions we cannot get to, we'll make sure that we'll publish the full list of Q&A on our blog, along with the recording of this webinar and the slides from the webinar. If you want to follow and get updates about our future webinars or future educational events, make sure you follow us on one of the social media channels or on our blog. Before I begin, a quick disclaimer. All the views and opinions presented in this presentation are my personal. I do not speak or represent the FDA or PMDA. So, FDA business rules. Why did they come about? How are they different from the FDA rules that were published a couple of years ago? How soon do you have to comply with them? All of these questions and more I hope to answer in this webinar. So to understand why the FDA business rules were released, it's important to understand how we got here. It all started in November of 2014 when FDA published their first official list of validation rules. It covered SDTM and SEND, and that was kind of the first time that FDA said, here's the rules that we actually execute at FDA. About a year later, PMDA followed suit, and they published a very similar list of rules, except they extended them to cover ATOM as well as defined XML. So these two set of rules is what's currently in production today. This is the rules that are executed at the agencies as well as the rules that are available in the various versions of the Pinnacle 21 software. Starting in last October, the things began to change. With the release of a new technical conformance guide, FDA introduced some changes to the validation rules section. And I'll talk in detail about what those changes are and what they mean to you guys. Along with the changes to this technical conformance guide, they also published the technical rejection criteria. I'll talk about that as well. It's interesting to point out that both of those were done just a couple of months before the December 17th deadline, when all new studies have to begin using standards that are part of the data standards catalog. So this was obviously done in preparation for that deadline. Another interesting time point is that in a couple of months ago in January, CDISC finally published their official list of rules for SDTM. And then just a few weeks ago, FDA published their business rules. So I'm going to go through a number of these to help you understand sort of how everything pieces together. So like I mentioned already, the existing rules, the rules that are currently in production, they were released all the way back in 2014 and 2015. We actually hosted webinars for each one of those when they first came out. So if you want to look back and refresh your knowledge on these, you can find the recordings of the webinars as well as the slides at the links provided on the slide. Another great resource if you're looking for information on rules or how the rules relate between FDA and PMDA, you can go to the Validation Rules browser, which you can find on our website under the Community menu. This is a resource that we update frequently, so you can always see sort of what is the existing official list of rules across agencies and how they relate. So in October, like I mentioned, October 2016, there were some major changes released in the Study Data Technical Conformance Guide. The biggest change was that FDA has, instead of just having one list of validation rules, they expanded and split it up into 3 different types of rules. And I'll go through each type. But the 2 new types that they introduced was the technical rejection criteria and the FDA business rules. So even though they just published the business rules a couple of weeks ago, the concept was actually introduced all the way back in October. And an interesting also fact is that they clarified sort of what is the role of the standard development organizations in development validation rules. So let's take a look at the three different types of validation rules that are now part of the technical conformance guide. Let's start with the technical rejection criteria. So, I think a lot of folks have been expecting this, especially with PMDA already publishing their rejection rules back in 2015. I think it was just a matter of time before FDA would do the same. So this technical rejection criteria that was published in October is basically the first steps in beginning to enforce the guidance that come into effect on December 17th. What was interesting is that they didn't publish it as a separate document. They just added it to the existing ECTD validation criteria. I don't know why it was done, whether it was done for expediency or just trying to get it out there as quickly as they could. We'll see if this continues in the future as more rules are released. But in either way, I think it's important to understand that this is just the beginning, and additional rejection rules will come out over time. Another interesting piece of information is that FDA actually didn't specify when these rules come into effect. All they promised is they would give an industry 30-day notice before they do. So what are these rules? How many are there? Well, there's only two so far. The first one, Rule 1734. All it says is that you must include a trial summary data set in both Module 4 and Module 5. So both your non-clinical and clinical studies should include a trial summary data set. And the second rule, 1736, it says that you either should have a demographics and defined XML for non-clinical data, or you should have demographics, subject level analysis data set, and defined XML for your clinical data. So this seems pretty straightforward, right? So the good news is these rules are not really new. They existed already. Many of them existed for many years. So if you use Pinnacle 21 software, those two rules are actually implemented as 4 different rules in our software. And the reason they're implemented as 4 different rules is because they span multiple standards. But these are the 4 rules. They cover all of the rejection criteria that is available today. So you already have it. You're already executing it. The only thing that will change is, one of our upcoming releases will swap the severity from an error to a reject. But otherwise, the rules are already available, and you can execute them now. So here's a little quiz part of the webinar. So take a couple of seconds and think, how many FDA applications do you think that came in since December 17th? So since the guidance took effect, they were actually compliant with 2 rejection rules. So take a moment just to guess. Take a wild guess. Well, FDA actually did a study. They ran a simulation. They basically took all the applications that they were receiving from the beginning of the year, and they looked to see how many of them had these rules that were triggered. And what they found out, and they presented these findings at the Fuse Computational Symposium just a couple of weeks ago, is they found that 45% of these applications would have been rejected if the criteria was enforced today. So this is a pretty bad number. It just shows how far the industry is from actually complying with some of the basic rejection criteria that is in place today. What makes it even more serious is that FDA basically is very lenient. If you compare them to what the PMDA has done, PMDA has 34 different rejection rules, and FDA has just 4 if you kind of normalize it the way we count that. So, there's a lot more rejection rules to come, and there's still very far that the industry has to go in order to comply with them. Now let's take a look at the standards conformance rules. One of the big changes was that FDA basically said, there's a lot of standards conformance rules that really should be the responsibility of the standard development organization. FDA is not in the best position to develop them because they're not the ones that are creating the standards. So, the way going forward is that CDISC will be responsible for providing validation rules for conformance, and FDA will no longer publish them. So, that was one big change. Since CDISC has published their rules just, in January, it makes this possible. So this was a big change, that was introduced in October. If you look at what rules are actually available from CDISC today, you're going to see that we have the rules for SDTM IG 3.2 that was released in January. We have the ADAM IG 1.0 rules that, I'll talk about that shortly. That was there for quite a while. The ADAM team is also working on version 1.1 of the implementation guide rules, which are planned for release in Q2. And then the non-clinical folks are also working on their version of the rules, and they started just recently, so it's not expected that it will be published until sometime in 2018. But this obviously leaves us with a couple of gaps, right? What about the rules for the previous versions of the standards? SDTM 3.1.3, 3.1.2. These are still standards that are supported by the data standards catalog. So, what about these rules? I don't have an answer for you. I think this is part of a discussion that's happening right now between the agencies and CDISC to determine, will CDISC go back and, see if what existing rules that they publish would actually go back. So this is all part of the discussion today. But there's definitely some gaps in what's available today, especially if you look at things like defined XML. The defined XML rules there was an effort in CDISC to create those rules, and there was a draft set of rules created a number of years ago. Pinnacle actually implemented those rules, but those rules were never published. I'm not sure why, but it's one of these other documents that there's no official rules available. And finally, when we come to the therapeutic area standards, none of the TOGs come with rules at the moment. So this is another huge challenge of how is this going to be handled in the future. So let's take a brief look at these rules that were released in January. So one of the things to understand is this was a multi-year effort. It took about 3 years, and the SDS team actually went line by line through the implementation guide, and they extracted all business rules. This is a very tedious process. They had to clarify a lot of misunderstandings or interpretations that people have when they read implementation guide, and they also had to agree on what the correct interpretation is. So this is why it was such a long effort, and this was obviously a lot of work put in, and we really appreciate the SDS team that did this. I mean, this is an extremely valuable piece of information. So they ended up coming up with 410 total rules. And what they did is they actually split them up into 2 different categories. The first one is programmable, and the second one is conditional. So programmable rules are those that could be implemented as automated checks. So this is standard checks that Pinnacle has implemented in the past. And then they have a new category, conditional, which are rules that may be programmable if you have some additional information available. A good example would be MedDRA checks. So if you have a MedDRA dictionary, you can execute the checks. If you don't have the MedDRA dictionary available, you can't execute those checks. Now, since Pinnacle implements rules from the submission context, we consider actually some of these conditional rules as programmable because that information is always present in submission. So if you take a look at the numbers, actually 17 of the 85 conditional rules are fully programmable for submission. So that raises the number to about 342 that are programmable. So the question is, how does Pinnacle 21 currently support these rules? So we actually did a gap analysis when they first came out, and we determined that about 2/3 of the rules are already covered. And those are the rules that you have available to you now. So that leaves us with about 1/3, 104 rules that we need to implement. We started this effort a couple of months ago. We're in the process of implementing them, and they will be implemented. I'll talk about the timeline shortly. There's also a few rules that either conflict with the FDA business rules or are potentially misclassified as programmable. I'll just give you just one example about a rule that there's a conflict between CDISC and FDA. So if you look at ARM and actual ARM variables, everybody understands that they're required variables per the implementation guide. And there's a business rule that states that required variables must always be included in the data set, and they cannot be null for any record. However, if you look at the FDA business rules, they say that for screen failures, when provided, should be included as a record in DM with the ARM field left blank. And very similar is said about the actual ARM. So CDISC says you cannot leave it blank. FDA says you should leave it blank. So it's obviously a conflict that needs to be resolved, I think before this is implemented and goes into production. So there's a number of conflicts like this that, that everybody's looking into right now to try to figure out what is the best path forward. Interestingly, if you look at the PMD set of rules, they actually agree with the CDISC version of the rule. So we don't even have consistency between the two agencies. So that obviously makes it harder to prepare the same data and send it to both agencies. Briefly about the ATOM IG rules. So the ATOM team has actually been the pioneers in CDISC and development of rules. They started all the way, I believe, in 2009 with their first list of rules being published all the way back in September of 2010. They updated it a number of times since, with the last update in January of 2015. If you want to see how Pinnacle implements those rules, we have a fairly detailed blog post at the link provided here in the slide that discusses how we implement them and what is the traceability between our implementation and the rules published by ATOM. So if you want to learn more about it, just check out that link. So now let's talk about the FDA business rules. So now that we understand that they were split into three, the one was technical rejection, which is new, but it's really just rules that existed in the past. They were just upgraded to a rejection status. And then there's the standard conformance, which was split away, to make it, so split the scope and responsibility. So what are business rules then? What are the FDA business rules? So what FDA really is interested in is that they want to answer a question: is the study data useful and supports meaningful review and analysis? That is the most important question that FDA wants to answer when they look at the data coming in from a submission. And that doesn't mean that it just has to be compliant with CDISC. That's just the baseline, right? If the data is not compliant with CDISC, that would be a violation of the of having standardized data. So what business rules are, it's additional rules above standards conformance that look at things like data quality, ability of FDA to use standardized tools, ability to support some internal processes. So, for example, the size of the files. So all of these things are things that are very important to the FDA. These rules are specifically extra things that FDA asked the industry to implement. They have done it in the past using the technical conformance guide. There was also a document called the CEDAR Common Issues document. So they tried to do this in the past. This is their first attempt to actually itemize those rules in a separate document. What's important to understand is that they don't replace any other rules. They're designed to complement the technical rejection, the standard conformance rules. We do understand that there's some overlap now, but that's just because they were being developed in parallel, so there was a little bit of overlap. I think that overlap will be resolved in the next few months as these rules are implemented and the industry gets a better look at these rules. But the goal is they are on top. They complement the other rules. And obviously they supersede anything that FDA has published in the past. So those rules from 2014, they're now legacy. Once these rules go into production, those rules will be fully replaced. So what does these FDA business rules look like? So if you download the spreadsheet from the FDA website, it's a very simple spreadsheet with just two columns. You have your business rule ID and you have your business rule. Now the IDs you'll notice are different from the IDs that FDA used for the previous set of rules. And really, the IDs are just purely an identifier. So when they release new versions, you can have some kind of a tracking to what rules were added, what rules were removed. They don't have any meaning in themselves. And the rules, if you look at the language, it's not written as a programming algorithm or as instructions for developers. They're written as requirements. Something that you would typically see in a technical conformance guide. And it's by design. It's supposed to be high level. It's supposed to be something that is going to be easy to manage. If you notice, there's only 45 rules, business rules, for clinical data, and there's 41 business rules for non-clinical data. So it's a very short list, and this is the way the FDA wants it. They want it to be short, they want it to be high level, so they can easily maintain it and update it much more frequently than they were able to do it in the past. Now, people would say, well, what is, that's very high, that's too high level for me, right? Some of these rules, I don't understand what goes into them. But that's okay. That's why FDA has published a second document, which they call Validator rules. So if you see, there's business rules that are accompanied by a second spreadsheet called Validator rules. So the Validator rules is exactly the details you're looking for. These are the specific implementation of the business rules in DataFit, which is the FDA's implementation of Pinnacle 21 Enterprise. The reason they publish them is for transparency. They want to make sure that the industry understands exactly how they implement those business rules. These are the rules, that's why it's called Validator rules, because they're the Pinnacle Validator rules. You can, this is the same rules that you can run in your version of Pinnacle software. But this is why this document is there, is to provide you some additional context and information so you understand what exactly these business rules and how they relate to the actual implemented rules. If you look at the spreadsheet, what they did is they took those two original columns that you saw in the business rule spreadsheet, and they added a few additional columns. So the third column, the FDA Validator rule, that's basically the description from the Pinnacle rules. So if you go to the Pinnacle validation browser site, you'll notice that these correlate to descriptions on our specific rules. There's also the list of domains that each rule applies to, and as well as the standards, and which version of the standard each rule applies to. So you'll notice a couple of things here. One is that the SEND 3.0, it says coming soon, the left column. They're still working on figuring out which of the implementation rules apply to the SEND business rules. So I would assume that this will be published very shortly, maybe in the next couple of weeks. And you'll notice in the first two columns, there's a whole bunch of blank cells. When I first looked at this, I was actually confused. I thought, what are these other rules that don't have a FDA business rule? But then I looked at it closer and I realized that the blank rows just mean that it's the same as the previously completed cells. So all of these blank rows actually apply to the third business rule about adverse events must be coded in measure dictionary. So don't get confused. These are just designed to kind of separate out the business rules so it's easier to read. But you have a full traceability here between the business rule and the actual validator rule that is implementing it. And if you look at the statistics, there's actually 115 validator rules for clinical data. So there's 45 business rules, there's 115 validator rules. So it's about a 1-to-3 ratio. So I don't know how many of you noticed, but there was another thing missing from that spreadsheet. There was no severity. So what happened to severity, right? That's something we saw for so many years. Where did it go? Well, FDA decided to no longer publish severity. And the reason, there's probably multiple reasons, but in my opinion, it's because there was a lot of confusion in the industry about what these severities meant. A lot of sponsors incorrectly assumed that warnings could be ignored. So you only have to fix the errors, and then you just ignore the warnings. That wasn't the case. That was not the intention. So in order to remove this confusion, all rules now, with the exception of rejection rules, of course, are now equal. So whether it's an error or a warning, the same rule applies, which says you have to either fix or explain all issues, right? So that FDA has been saying this for many years. That's a statement right in from the technical performance guide. You should really treat all rules the same. and you should attempt to fix them if they're fixable and explain them if they're not. So now that we kind of see what these rules are about, I guess in summary, it's not sort of a huge changing event. It's just FDA decided to sort of redefine what the rules are, split them up so people understand who's responsible for what set of rules. CDISC now has a big role to play. They have to provide the rules. They're the ones that are creating the standards. They're responsible for providing the rules for the compliance with that standard. That makes it much easier for FDA to maintain their set of rules, which are much shorter now, just 45 rules. And now they can focus on things like making sure that they're putting out things there that actually matters to them the most, which is that they can perform meaningful review and analysis. So now with these in place, like what's the action plan? Where should we go from here as an industry? So I prepared a number of slides to just give you some recommendations and tell you about expectations you should have from all players in the industry. So I'll start with talking about what to expect from us. What is Pinnacle going to do to help you guys comply with these new rules? So since CDISC released the rules for SDTM, we've been working to implement these new rules. Our goal is to have the rules for SDTM 3.2 as well as for ADAM-IG version 1.1 when that gets finalized. They have both set of these rules implemented this year. We're also going to be implementing rules for Define 2.1, which is something that is in draft mode right now, but it's going to come out later this year. One interesting piece in Define 1.1, it's a piece that is very important to us. You can actually specify now the version of CDISC control terminology that you're using, which is, for us, it's very important because when we get a submission to FDA, we have no idea what version of terminology you use. I mean, it's in the reviewer guide, but the reviewer guide is not machine readable. So we always run the validation against the latest version of control terminology, which is, you can assume, produces a number of false positives. So 2.1 is really important. Once 2.1 is available, we can actually run validations that are exactly against the version that you specified. So we're going to work on those rules, whether if CDISC publishes them or not. We'll try to have a set of implementation rules available to help you guys upgrade to version 2.1. And as the SEND team is working on their version of the rules, we're not going to wait until they're finished. We're going to work in parallel as they publish rules, sort of in the draft mode. We're going to work in parallel. We're going to try to implement as many of them as we can to help the team, one, to test those rules out, and two, just to make sure that once they're finally released, that there's a much smaller, shorter gap between the release date and when the rules are available. So this is definitely the year of the rule. We're going to be working a lot of rules this year. There's going to be a lot more rules coming out than in the past couple of years. Another thing is that we're going to be working very closely with FDA, PMDA, as well as CDISC to make sure that all rules are clear, that there's no problems with the actual rule definition, there's no problems with the actual implementation of the rules, and any kind of conflicts that I showed you an example of are actually resolved before this goes into production. I think this is very important now that the stakes have been raised. You have rejection criteria from PMDA, you have rejection criteria from FDA. I think it definitely raises the expectations on Pinnacle to provide a much higher quality product, and we're taking this very seriously, and we're definitely going to invest a lot more resources in ensuring that the rules are clear, complete, and high quality. And this is why we're also going to be launching a public beta of all of our rules and new software in August. So instead of just coming out with, say, here's the new rules, they've been released to production, we decided that it's smart to roll out a number of beta versions prior to going to production to give the industry time to, first of all, we can solicit some feedback from you guys. I mean, there's probably some rules that you disagree with. So maybe it's the implementation of the rule, maybe you disagree with the actual business rule itself. So we're able to collect that feedback, and we were able to talk with either FDA, PMD, or CDISC to try to resolve it before this actually goes into production. So we hope that a lot of you guys will take a little bit of time of your daily workload and participate in the beta. And our goal is to have a production release in November, which would definitely include the SDTM 3.2 and ADAM-IG 1.1. And I would say that we probably would have the beta version of the Define 2.1 and SEND IG 3.1 available in the production release. So this is our, for this year. One other area that we already started this year is that we have this new concept that we call good data validation practices. There's still, we feel, a lot of issues with just a lack of knowledge about, what is validation, what all these different rules mean, how to run the validation, how to configure the tools, how to interpret the validation results. We still have a lot of people who have difficulty doing this. How to evaluate the risk of issues for submission. A lot of people, submit data for submission with issues that are quite risky. That would result either in the future could result in rejection or definitely could result in information requests, which, wastes time, causes delays. So we want to help you understand what issues are high risk, what issues are low risk, and we, help you fix the data or help you explain the data. A lot of people I know just from looking at the reviewer guides, when I see submissions coming in at FDA, I look at a lot of the reviewer guides and a lot of the explanations are just not very good. I mean, it's just very generic. They don't actually provide any valuable information to the reviewer. I mean, this is an area that it needs a lot of improvement. So what we are doing is we're planning to have a number of papers, blogs, webinars, and training specifically in this concept of good data validation practices. We already started. We presented a couple of presentations at a couple of local events. There was a CDISC user group in New Jersey where we talked about this. There's a few single-day events in Boston on April 27th that I'm presenting on this topic. Also at the same time in CDISC in London, in the conference there, Sergey Sirchenko, one of our co-founders, he's also going to be presenting on this concept at the CDISC conference. So if you get a chance to visit one of these events, definitely check out our presentation. This is a highly educational, that talks about validation and how you can improve the way you guys currently do validation today. So, you know what to expect from Pinnacle. What should you expect from the regulatory agencies, right? So I obviously don't speak for the regulatory agencies, but as an observer, I can tell you what I would expect. So FDA already made it clear they're going to update the validator rules in the near term to add support for SEND IG 3.0. So that's a pretty clear, sort of a short-term expectation. But however, over long term, if you look at what FDA has said, if you look at what FDA has written in the technical conformance guide, they made it very clear that they plan to update the business rules much more frequently than they updated the previous set of rules in the past. Partly because it's very small set of rules, so it'll be easier to maintain, and partly is because there's a lot of activity happening at the FDA. They're getting more and more experience with standardized data. There's now a lot more cross-center collaboration where it's not just CDER or CBER is very actively involved, and there's other divisions that are looking into using standards. As more of this is happening and as more experience they get, you should expect more business rules that come out that help them ensure that the data is going to help them do meaningful review and analysis. So I would definitely expect more frequent changes from FDA going forward. So what do you expect from PMDA? So PMDA has released their set of rules in 2015. Obviously, they don't incorporate any of these new CDISC rules. They don't incorporate any sort of maybe something they could be learned from the FDA business rules. And they have been doing, since 2015, they've been doing a number of pilots, submission pilots using standardized data. So there's a lot of experience there. So I would assume that sometime this year, PMDA is going to publish a new set of rules incorporating all these changes. So now that we understand what the expectations are, the question is, what should you guys do as users? And I'm going to split my feedback across enterprise users and community users. It's slightly different. So if you're an enterprise user, one advantage you have is that, we maintain your environment, right? So we ensure that you have the same code base, that you have the same validation rules, same patches that are currently deployed at the agencies. So, with a managed environment, we ensure that you're always compatible, that you always have the same software that is run at FDA and PMDA. So there's very little you have to do. You guys are going to be getting advance notice. You're going to be getting release notes. You're going to be, you just have to kind of work with the system, and we'll make sure that you guys are always in sync. Where we are asking for your help is we could definitely use your feedback during the beta period. What we're going to do is you're going to start seeing, so you have, let's say, SDTM 3.2. You can validate against this SDTM 3.2 right now in the system. You'll get another option that says SDTM 3.2 beta. So that would be that new set of rules. So you'll be able to set up, so if you're working on a study, you can set up another data package, flip it to the new set of rules, and then run it to see sort of what the differences are. So, and that's going to be very helpful because we can get some feedback to make sure that there's the rules that are actually being developed and implemented. You guys have no disagreements with them, that there's nothing that has been missed by us or by the agencies or by CDISC. So we really appreciate if you guys could do that. I know that a number of you have already participated in private betas before, and we hope you continue doing so. And finally, I hope you can attend our educational events, read our the blogs and the papers we plan to publish on good data validation practices. I think this will be very educational, helpful for you to ensure that you know what to do with all these issues that our system generates, right? So I know we generate a lot of issues and we say we have a lot of problems, but now we actually want to help you fix those problems by helping you understand what they are, how to interpret them, how to prioritize them, how to fix them. So this is what the actions that you should expect to take throughout this year. So now let's take a look at the community users. So the big difference between enterprise users and community users is that community users, you host your own software, you're responsible for configuring it. We provide the software, but it's your responsibility to actually set it up. And you have to ensure that what you're running is compatible with the agencies. So if you look at what versions are actually compatible, if you look at FDA, FDA is running a version of Enterprise that is compatible with version 2.2 of Community, right? So if you're not using version 2.2 of Community, you're not running the compatible version. If you look at PMDA, they're actually compatible with 2.13 or above. So you got to be using one of these versions in order to actually run the same rules that the FDA is running, or the same rules that PMD is running. So it's very important. So what we actually did is we ran a little study very similar to what FDA has done with the rejection criteria. We looked at the metrics we collect from the community software to see over the same time period. So since the guidance has in December 17th took effect, what versions are people actually using, right? So what we found is we found a huge discrepancy between the Japanese users and everybody else. So what we have done is we split those numbers up so you guys can see the difference. If you look at the US and European users primarily, only 41% is actually using version 2.2, which is the version that's compatible with FDA. The rest are either using slightly older versions, maybe 2.01, 2.1, 2.11. But what's even worse is 23% is using a 1.x version, right? So 1.x is when it's still called OpenCDISC. The big problem with that is that the FDA rules have been released after 1x. They were released together with 2.0 version of the community. So if you're using 1.x, you're not even close to being compatible. And unfortunately, 23% of users are still on the version that is, you're not getting, so I always get asked these two questions. Is community and enterprise version identical? Right? I always get that, and obviously the answer to that is no. It's two separate products. One is a desktop tool. One is so the desktop tool is designed basically for individual programmers to do their QC of their deliverables. And Enterprise is a hosted version that's a managed version that's designed for teams. So it's not the same version. But the question that's more relevant is, does the community version generate the same validation results as Enterprise version? So that's a very valid question. And, it's very difficult to answer because I always tell people, well, that depends on what version of community you're using and whether you have installed and configured it correctly, right? What this number showing me is that 59% of users, at least, are not getting the same validation results at FDA, right? So it's really up to you. I mean, we're just provide the free software, but it's your responsibility to ensure you're compatible with the agency. Now, for the positive is that if you look at the Japanese users, 83% are using the version that PMDA recommends. So there's a huge difference. I think it's very clear why PMDA has been strict in promoting the rejection criteria and beginning to enforce rejection criteria. So people are taking it seriously, and people are trying to actually run the same rules that PMDA is running. But on the U.S. side, because FDA has been lenient over the years, a lot of companies believe that, if they've done it 10 times before and there was never any problems, then why make a change? Well, I'll tell you, past performance is no indication of future performance. So it's time to take it seriously, because if FDA rejection criteria goes into effect, a lot of you might run into significant problems. So it's very important that you guys take this extremely seriously. I mean, I can provide you the software, but I cannot force you to use a particular version. So it's really up to you guys to handle that. Now, we looked at another component of this, right? So you might be using the latest version, 2.2, but there's a number of configuration steps, right? You have to set up your own MEDRA, and you have to set up your own SNOMED, because these are licensed dictionaries. We're not able to provide it to you automatically. So we looked at the number of users that actually have these configured. And what we found out is that 68.3% of users do not have MEDRA configured. MEDRA are FDA business rules, right? So 68% of users, even if you're using the latest version of the tool, you're not running any of the MEDRA checks. So this is another area where, you're not going to get the same validation results as the agency. It's just, I can tell you for sure, you're definitely not going to get the same results as the agency. But when you look at SNOMED, I mean, that's just ridiculous. 99.8% did not set up SNOMED. It's probably 2 people in the industry that set up SNOMED. And I'm not kidding. I think I know who they are. So, this is very bad. You guys need to start looking, you got to look at when you look at the download page has all the information you need to set up the system. So make sure that, if it's you're doing it, or if it's your IT staff that's doing it, that you follow those instructions, you set up the software correctly. I do not want to be responsible for you getting a rejection. So if you look at the other common issues with compatibility, I already mentioned using older versions and not configuring MEDRA and SNOMED. But there's a lot of other things that you could do that would not produce the same validation results. One is if you customize those XML configuration documents. Now, it's actually they're done this way in order to allow you to customize them, but you're not supposed to customize them for submission purposes. You could customize them if you're working on some maybe intermediary deliverables, that are not final data. Maybe you want to validate your data before loading into your data warehouse, so there's a separate set of rules that you want to run. All of those valid use cases for customizing the software. But when it comes to submission, you have to use it exactly as is. Because if you make any changes, if you disable some rules because you don't like them, or if you do, anything you do to that file, you potentially are breaking compatibility. It's just like buying a car, right? If you buy a car and you make any customizations to it, there's no warranty. It's the same concept here. This tool is designed to ensure that you have the same validation results as the agency if it's used correctly. Same thing with the CDISC terminology files. We see this as a major problem. The terminology files that we make available on our website and are, when you download the software, there's a subset of them available. You can get older versions on our website from the download page. Those are not exactly the same files that you can download from the NCI website. We take those files and we extend them to enable additional validations. A good example would be validating that your baseline flags have a value of yes. If you look at CDISC control terminology, there's no code list for just yes. There's a code list for yes, no, unknown, and not applicable. So if you validate against that code list, that would allow you to put in a no and not applicable in the baseline flag, which is not allowed. So what we do is we take that original code list, we subset it, we create multiple subsets, And when our validation runs, we validate against the subset. Whether based on selected yes or not yes, it's actually a PMDA rejection rule. So if you're not using our version of CDISC control terminology, if you're using your own version, you're going to fail that PMDA rejection rule. And there was a number of sponsors that learned that from the pilot, that they ran into this exact problem. So it's very important if you customize the CDISC files, the terminology files, that you do it correctly and you do not delete any of our extensions. And finally, we see a lot of users, not a lot of users, but there's a good subset of users that that are using the software. It's a desktop tool, right? It was designed as a desktop tool. We only test it on a desktop. As you can imagine, we can't possibly test it in every possible server configuration. There's hundreds of flavors of server operating systems. There's a lot of other configurations that deals with shared environments. It's just not possible for us to test it in those environments. So when you deploy it in a server environment or in a shared environment, it's really off-label use. We honestly don't know whether it's going to run the same way or whether it's going to produce the same validation results. So keep that in mind. When you're doing this, you're doing it at your own risk. So, with that, I want to, bring it, sort of summarize what I, sort of the point of this presentation. And I'll open up to questions. One thing is that, FDA has really clarified what all these rules are. There's 3 different types of rules. Who's responsible? They made it very clear now. When you look at priority, what rules should I comply with, right? If there's conflicts, which is today there's conflicts. And what I would recommend, obviously, FDA rejection rules they take priority. You have to comply with those first, followed by FDA business rules, and then followed by the standards conformance rules. That is the priority in which I would recommend. You can always rely on us. We have been doing this since 2008. We're going to continue releasing tools. We're going to continue updating rules. We're going to make sure that every single company in the industry, whether you're the biggest pharma company to the smallest biotech with 2 guys in the garage, that you're able to validate your data against the minimal requirements. That is the goal of our project, and that's why it's free, and that's why it's open source. We're going to continue doing that, but you have to understand that, if you're using a free version, it's your responsibility to ensure it's compatible. You have to ensure that it's validated, that it's running in a validated environment. If your company has a difficulty doing that, then you should consider upgrading to enterprise, which is a managed environment, and we do that for you. So you have those 2 options available to you. So make sure that you're not taking unnecessary risks. With that, I'll go ahead and I'll switch over to the questions. All right, let's see. We have a number of questions here. Okay, here's a good question. What is the role would the FDA continue to have the acceptance or approval of the CDISC developed standards conformance rules? Basically, would FDA approve or disapprove of CDISC rules? In the past, that was the kind of what people assumed, that because FDA published rules that look like standards conformance, that they were accepting or approving or disapproving. That was never the intent. FDA has absolutely no plans to approve or not approve CDISC rules. CDISC rules are the property of, the business rules for CDISC are the property of CDISC organization. They understand what was meant when they created the implementation guide. They will decide what the rules are. FDA will just advise that people comply with those rules. So the next question is the trial summary data set required for all submissions? IND, NDA, and so on. It's basically required for Module 4 and Module 5. The question is, does it required for studies, after December 17th, or even studies that started before? That's a good question. FDA hasn't made that clear, right? So I know that you would think that maybe since the guidance only applies to new studies, at this point it's not very clear. So I don't have an answer here. I would definitely, if you're not sure, I would definitely check with your reviewer or send an email to the eData team and ask them whether these rejection rules apply to just the new studies or does it apply to the existing submission. So this is definitely a good question to ask the agency. how will you uniquely identify the 115 validator rule? So that's a good question. That's always a challenge for us to keep sort of the traceability between all the different rules. So one of the things that we have been doing for many years is if you run the tool, you'll notice there's an extra column. There's the Pinnacle rule ID, and then there's the publisher ID, right? So the publisher ID is our traceability. So every rule that what we're going to run is going to have either an FDA ID, or it's going to have a CDISC ID, or it's going to have a PMDA ID. So whoever is the creator of the rule, it's going to be in the publisher ID column. So that's how we're going to maintain traceability. And we, of course, going to maintain all that information on our website, on the Validator rules browser. So when you guys look at it, it'll be very easy to see sort of who's the source of the rule. The next question is, if FDA no longer provides severity, will this impact severity provided by Pinnacle 21? That's a good question. So obviously it's a problem for us because severity is kind of a critical part of the system. It's available in all the reports. We're trying to figure out how to deal with it because right now the PMDA rules still do have severity. So we have severity on the PMDA rules, and then we don't have them on FDA rules, and a lot of these rules overlap. So we're going to work with both agencies to figure out what is the best path forward. It's possible that the severity is going to basically be changed to just two different severities, reject and not reject. So that's one possibility. So it still will be there. It's just that instead of being severity, it's just going to be a flag of whether it's a rejection rule or not a rejection rule. But we haven't made the final decision. We're still working on that. What is the timing of incorporating the SEND IG 3.0 rule? So if you look at, obviously if you run either the community or enterprise version, those rules are already in the system. They've been out there for a long time. The FDA has actually, when they were creating the business rules, this was also considered. It's just that something happened in the last moment and they just couldn't make the timeline because they were trying to release them in time for the Fuse Computational Science Conference. So I believe it's just a matter of weeks before they update the document and include SEND 3.0. So I would, really keep an eye on their website in the next couple of weeks. I'm sure they'll be updated by then. Let's see. What is the timeline for beta? Right, so I already mentioned the beta, and this is public beta. Everybody's going to get it, enterprise, community, it doesn't matter, in August. So we're going to make, so the community version is actually going to be called version 3. So, so now it's 2.2, the latest version. We'll probably do a 2.21 in the next couple of weeks just to include some, just to flip those reject flags on the FDA rules and to include some recent terminology. So expect 2.21 probably next week or in 2 weeks at most. And then the next release will be version 3.0 beta. So it'll be beta 1, beta 2. We'll see how many betas are necessary. But the goal is that in August there'll be a beta. Enterprise clients, they'll just get, it's going to look a little different to you. You're just going to get basically new set of rules show up in the system that are marked as beta, right? So that's going to be, but both enterprise and community, you guys are going to get access to beta because we obviously want to get as much feedback as possible because, I know when CDISC rules just came out, and I read through the public review and I looked those rules and I had no questions. But when I had a number of questions, but when we actually started implementing them, we ended up with a lot more questions. So this is what you typically have. Until people actually use the rules, it's hard to sort of understand their impact. But when people actually apply them to real data, it's much easier to see potential problems. And this is what we want to do with the beta. Get your feedback as early as possible. The next question is about HooDrug. Is it planned to integrate HooDrug? Yes, actually. I just had a meeting with them a couple of days ago, and we're talking to them very actively. Our goal is to add HooDrug in time for the beta in August. So HooDrug will definitely be supported this year. The next question is, Yes, so there's a question about enterprise versus community. You mentioned enterprise version is hosted and intended for teams. How does one team member access a validation run that was run by another team member? So I guess this is a question from a community user. I can host a whole separate webinar on discussing the differences, but the best way to explain it is, the community is a desktop tool, right? So everybody has their own version. You run it, you get an Excel report. So it's like a personalized tool, right? In enterprise, it's centralized. So everything that's run in the same server, in the same database. So if everybody who runs a validation, all of those reports are available in the system, right? Because it's a centralized tool. And that's why we call it for teams, because it's centralized. You can see the validations for the studies they have access to. You can collaborate either with your peers in the company or with your vendors, your CROs. You can do what we call issue management. You can say, hey, can you help me fix this problem, or can you explain this problem? So it's really designed as a collaborative tool, a management tool, on top of just running validations. That's why we say it's not really the same tool. They both run validations, but enterprise is really about helping you manage the validation process, manage your issues in the team environment. If you want to learn more, you should just go to our website. There's some information on the product and describes the various features. Is it planned to improve the checks for duplicates? Yes. This has definitely been a difficult check. I admit it probably should have been done differently. We are planning to improve the check in a number of ways. We're going to look to see, one is we're going to use the defined XML to look at your keys. There's only one problem with that, is that a lot of companies I see their domain keys in defined XML are not the real key. Like, a lot of companies will put a sequence number in the key, or they will just include like all of their columns in the key. So the problem is that the quality of the key sometimes is not very good. So this check was actually, and this is actually, let me explain this concept. This is an important concept to understand. It's actually part of our good data validation practices presentation. In the past, when we had errors and warnings, right? Errors meant that we know 100% that you have a problem, right? So start date after end date, or you extended a non-extensible code list, right? This is 100% probability that there's some issue with what you have done, right? Warnings were not really validation checks. They were more reports for manual review, right? So, for example, duplicates is a good example, but another good example that everybody uses in presentations is lab test results without a unit, right? So, as everybody understands, because every sponsor can extend that code list, there's no way software can know for sure about which test has units and which tests don't, right? So what we do is we produce a report. So that particular check, it doesn't say you have a definite problem. All it says is that, hey, there's some tests here that don't have units that we don't recognize. Can you please manually review it and then decide for yourself whether this is an issue or not? This is why we used to call them warnings. So I think a lot of folks just need to understand that, validation is not black and white. It's not like you're either wrong or you're either right. It's really a combination. Sometimes we know that it's wrong or right, and sometimes, we just need to tell you that there's a potential problem for you to review. If you don't have that check at all, then we won't catch any problems, right? So it's like an issue. Do you check or don't you not check? Like, what's better, to have a false negative or false positive? So what I'll tell you is that as far as duplicates go, this rule could definitely be improved. We are working on improving it now. And it will produce a lot less false positives in the future. So I'll take one more question and then we'll wrap it up. All the other questions you guys submitted, we will we'll take them. We'll answer all of them. We'll put them up on our blog. They'll be available in a few weeks. You'll get an email with the links to all of the information. But let me take one more. Let me look. Let's see. Pick a good one. Let's see. When will the new FDA business rules be implemented in Pinnacle 21? As you already saw, when FDA published the business rules, they also published the validator rules. So what that means is that they're already all implemented in Pinnacle 21. So all the FDA business rules are already implemented. So the only rules, so if you look at our rules that are you currently running right now, the rejection rules are implemented, the FDA business rules are implemented. The only thing that's missing is about 104 standards conformance rules. That is the only gap that we have right now, and we're working on closing it. So with that answer, I hope I provide you guys useful information today. If you have any follow-up questions, you can definitely reach out to us on our forum, or you can send us an email through our website. We're going to record this webinar. We're going to put it up on YouTube like we always do in the past. The slides are going to be available on the blog, and all the questions are going to be answered and put up on the blog as well. Thank you guys for joining us again. Please watch out for additional announcements, for additional educational seminars, webinars, papers that we're going to post later this year. And thank you once again for your support, and we're looking forward to presenting to you again sometime in the near future. Thank you.